Hello everyone, I'm Emmett Church, the Alternate Historian. You know, I always thought I would enjoy a chance to comment on a counterfactual made by a sitting American president, but I was wrong.
On May 1st, 2017, President Donald Trump had this to say to SiriusXM's Selena Zito. I mean, had Andrew Jackson been a little later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart. He was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, "There's no reason for this. People don't realize, the Civil War if you think about it. Why? People don't ask that question, but why was there the Civil War? Why could that one not have been worked out?"
Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that statement, so please bear with me.
First, let's discuss Trump's proposed alternate history of Andrew Jackson, who was president of the United States from 1829 to 1837. Trump suggested if he was somehow president later, he could have prevented the American Civil War. This would be an amazing feat for Jackson to accomplish, especially since he died in 1845 at the age of 78, 16 years before the Civil War began. That said, you could argue that if Jackson somehow lived longer, he could by sheer force of personality produce a compromise, but that would put a lot of strain on a 93-year-old Jackson. Snark aside, it certainly seems that Trump misspoke and meant to say that Jackson foresaw a future clash between the North and the South, but didn't think it was inevitable and could have been solved without violence. In fact, if I was being completely honest, it's not a completely implausible what if you consider Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833. For those who don't know, the nullification crisis was a confrontation between the state of South Carolina and the federal government. South Carolina was angry over tariffs passed in 1828 and 1832 that they felt stifled their economy. Thus, they declared them to be unconstitutional, and therefore null and void within their boundaries, and prepared their military in case the federal government sent troops to enforce the tariffs. Jackson, though a defender of states' rights, found the tariffs to be reasonable, and thus opposed nullification. In fact, during the crisis, he made the following toast: "Our federal union, it must be preserved." To back up these words, Jackson ordered the Army and Navy to prepare for an invasion of South Carolina, but that proved unnecessary. Congress passed a compromise tariff, and South Carolina withdrew their objections. Now, Trump has publicly expressed admiration of Jackson, going as far as to read a biography of him and hang his portrait in the Oval Office. Trump also sees himself as a populist like Jackson. In fact, from Trump's point of view, his conflicts with sanctuary cities over immigration and his fight against states that have legalized marijuana might just be a modern version of nullification to him.
Nevertheless, Jackson's not the best president to model your administration on. For example, Jackson owned slaves and also used the U.S. Post Office to block abolitionist pamphlets.
Jackson was also president during the infamous Trail of Tears, which saw the removal of Native American tribes indigenous to the southeastern U.S. to areas west of the Mississippi River. This is made even worse once you realize there was a Supreme Court decision at the time that sided with the Native Americans in their right to remain on their lands, but Jackson chose to ignore this. In fact, in Harry Turtle's Joe Steele, the alternate Joseph Stalin, who became president of the United States, admired Jackson as well, and cited Jackson's dismissal of the Supreme Court as precedent for him ignoring their rulings while he transformed America into a dictatorship.
Let's just hope Trump doesn't read that book.
Now, let's address the most bizarre claim made by Trump in his interview, that people don't ask questions about why there was a Civil War. Such a claim is silly. The American Civil War is one of the most written about topics in American history. There is an ocean of literature on it, ranging from celebrated multi-volume works of history to television shows and films set in the era. People still dress up like Union and Confederate soldiers and stage mock battles to give their audience a living example of history.
Elaine and I even visited the site of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was packed with people either visiting the museum or just wandering the battlefield. This isn't an era of history that people don't know anything about.
Even our favorite genre features loads of American Civil War stories. In fact, next to World War II, the American Civil War was the most written about era in English-language alternate histories. Thus, the fact that an American president from the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, and the leader of the United States during the war, could even imply that the Civil War was just one big misunderstanding is ludicrous.
Because we know what the Civil War was about. It was about slavery.
Okay, I can already hear the clicking of the keys as angry commenters write to tell me how wrong I am and it was about states' rights and how I'm an SJW and blah blah blah, but just take a moment to listen. The fact of the matter is, no one can deny that slavery was a serious divisive issue in the early United States. Thomas Jefferson was forced to remove passages from the original draft of the Declaration of Independence that condemned slavery after southern states objected to it. The South also rejected plans to raise regiments of slaves to fight in the Revolutionary War for their freedom, despite desperate manpower shortages at the time. It's almost as if they feared arming and trading people who had been oppressed for generations might end badly for the slavers. No wonder thousands of blacks fled across British lines and joined up with them when they made the same offer during the war. As the young country grew, there were plenty of times when the fight over slavery almost led to its dissolution. The Constitution of the United States almost never made it out of committee when the slave states demanded that their slave populations be counted toward the representation in Congress, despite the fact that the slaves themselves themselves would never vote. Meanwhile, slavery in the early 19th century became indispensable to the Southern economy, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, which made the harvest of cotton, one of the South's greatest exports, not only easier but much more profitable. The cotton gin, however, also led to an expansion of slavery, as more slaves were needed to work the machines. Despite how profitable slavery was for the South, slavery was becoming more unpopular elsewhere. Many nations across the world ended slavery, and abolitionist sentiment in the United States was growing, especially among devout Christians who saw the practice as immoral. Northern politicians also feared losing their voice in the federal government, as more slave states entered the Union west of the Mississippi River. In response, the South made up several ideological defenses of slavery. These included pseudoscience claims that slaves were racially inferior, and thus slavery was good for them in the long run. Others even went as far as to make biblical arguments in defense of slavery by pointing to Noah's curse on his son Ham, justifying enslavement of Africans. Nevertheless, these arguments weren't persuasive outside the South, and when the anti-slavery Lincoln was elected in 1860, the South saw no other alternative except to resort to violence to protect slavery, and thus seceded from the Union and began the American Civil War by firing on Fort Sumter in 1861. At the beginning of the American Civil War, it was pretty clear to the South that the conflict was about slavery. A few weeks before the firing in Fort Sumter, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens had this to say: "Our new government is founded upon exactly this idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Additionally, many of the ordinances of secession made by the Southern states directly mention slavery as the reason they left the Union. For example, South Carolina declared in their ordinance that they seceded because, and I quote, "increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery." Meanwhile, the Texas Ordinance of Secession accused the Republican Party of creating, and I quote, "a unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law." As the war was fought, however, the Confederate government was pragmatic enough to realize that slavery wasn't popular, especially among potential allies like Great Britain and France. As I mentioned in a previous video, in an attempt to woo the most powerful nations at the time for support and recognition, the Confederate government began to argue that the war was about states' rights, harkening back to the philosophy that was at the center of the nullification crisis. After the war, people who wanted to redeem the Confederacy took the states' rights argument and ran with it. Thus, slavery is downplayed, omitted, or even defended by pro-Confederates, and the war becomes defined by states' rights. But they made sure to leave out the important distinction that the specific right they were talking about was the right to have slaves. Because we shouldn't forget that slavery is bad. Millions in America were oppressed and exploited so their labor could enrich a minority who led the country into one of its most bloody conflicts. There are revisionist historians at work today trying to make you forget this, and it seems that they even managed to convince the American president.
I realize I'm not going to convince many true Confederate diehards, but for those who are on the fence, I hope, at the very least, I convince you to learn more about the subject.
Maybe if Andrew Jackson lived a longer life, he could have prevented the war, but I doubt it. Not only would he be extremely old, even for our time period, he would also be a Southern slaver who directly benefited from the same system the Confederacy was trying to defend. I find it hard to believe even he would take sides against the South in such a scenario. And as for Trump, I really hope he takes the opportunity to learn a few things about his predecessors in the limited free time he has, because it certainly seems like he's just starting to learn about his own country's history. Granted, Trump was a successful businessman, and you don't need to know history to make money. But he isn't in the private sector anymore. He's the President of the United States, for better or worse. Learning more about past presidents and how not to repeat their mistakes will be better for his administration and the country as a whole. Otherwise, I fear we'll have more embarrassing moments like this in the future.
Well, that is what to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.